In this video, I'm going to show you how I carved this raccoon. I have a block of plywood. So in the first video of this series, I showed you how I made this large block of plywood to carve this raccoon out of. In this video, I'm going to show you exactly how I carved it and what tools I used. I'm gearing this towards people that are interested in power carving and kind of want to start going down that road. So to rough stuff out, I'm starting with a chainsaw. If you're new to woodworking, new to tools, I'm not going to recommend using the chainsaw. You can see I could remove material quickly, but it's not a beginner-friendly tool. If you have an angle grinder, a great way to start removing material is to buy some carving discs, put it in the angle grinder, and that will remove material very quickly. I have a couple different grades in the shop. Cutsaw can be sold on Amazon. A lot of the bits I'm using are Cutsaw brand. They're a little more expensive, but that disc I showed, the green one, I've had for well over 5 years. I've carved all sorts of stuff with it. It works really well. The other discs I have in the video is a tool review I did. They're called graph bits. Much cheaper bits. They work really well, but they're not going to last as long as the Cutsaw. And you can see in the beginning, roughing this out is just going to be a series of removing big chunks of material based on my lines. I had a rough proportional photo of a raccoon that I drew on here. I'm not a great drawer, which is a little bit of my downfall. So you could see as I'm carving, because I'm also not someone who carves every day, what I like to do is draw lines, remove material, and work slowly. So I'm not going to take off big chunks. If you watch people that do chainsaw carving and whatnot, they know their lines really well and they can cut stuff down very quickly. Another tool I'm using, which is not as aggressive as the angle grinder but more aggressive than a Dremel, is a die grinder with a various supply of burrs and bits. Once again, these are also Cutsaw, and these are going to be rated based on extreme levels of removal. So you can buy fine grit bits, you can buy coarse grit bits that will remove material faster. I have a variety of bits that I've gathered over the years. Unfortunately, sometimes with carvings, it's a process of figuring which ones work out. These long cylindrical ones worked really well for this. I could kind of get into all the nooks and crannies. So the beginning process, the chainsaw at this point, I'm almost completely done with. I just remove large chunks. You really don't need it if you want to start power carving. And now it's a process of going back and forth with different bits in the angle grinder and the die grinder in order to start working on this. Now, as I said, I was kind of carving as I went, so the face was giving me some problems at this point. It was kind of looking like a pig nose, so I decided to add the arms, and adding the arms can really help form the rest of the figure. So in order to add the arms, which was something I knew I was going to have to do going into this, I had left a couple pieces of scrap. I can dowel into those and add the arms so that they're going to stand up straight, and this piece holds a boom box, which is a Bluetooth player, which is why those arms are so hyperextended. And you can see I'm just marking where those need to go, doweled them in place, and added the arms. They're temporarily attached just so I could lay out the face a little bit more. And at this point I decided the ears, I didn't have enough material on the top of this to form the ears, so same process, I cut that area flat and just added blocks. The one plus side of carving with plywood is going to be all of these parts that I added, which I knew I was going to have to add. That was part of my plan, believe it or not. Really are kind of hidden with how I glued together the block. And as you can see, I just drew a rough ear on there. I'm going to use the angle grinder to very, very quickly remove material up to that line. I could come back in with the die grinder and get my inside curves, my outside curves, much easier than the angle grinder, because the surface area of the angle grinder removes quite a bit of material and just rough shape everything. Like I said, I started working on this in August. I've been working on it on and off. I'm not a professional carver, so there would be days where I didn't like the way it looked. I'd put it aside for a week and come back to it. Sometimes that's really what you need instead of pushing through. If your proportions aren't looking right, your face isn't looking right. Like I said, I had a problem with the snout of this, looked like a pig for a very, very long time, and I would just work on it until I got exhausted by it. It seemed like nothing was working, put it aside, and come back. Now this carving is going to be a stylized carving, which means it's going to replicate a raccoon, but it's not going to be high detail. One of the reasons I decided on that is I have carved plywood before, which isn't necessarily a beginner-friendly material because of all the varying grain patterns. But I knew, and I kind of showed an example here, that carving fur into it was just going to chip out that plywood. So I was just going to leave the entire thing smooth. That is a decision going into it. I knew was going to be a process. It also meant I had a lot more sanding to do on this because the fur wouldn't hide any imperfections in the piece. But if you want to start doing something like this and you want to glue together some slap together some scrap ply in order to start, that is something to consider. You're not really going to get a lot of fine detail in a plywood carving because it just wants to start chipping out. So the face at this point, you could see I took quite a bit of material off the front. It almost looks like a pyramid if you're looking down the snout, and then that is when it really started to take shape on me. And I could also add the feet. I could start carving the arms, which I kept detached at this point because these pieces are going to be easier to carve separated from the piece. But then at this point I didn't really know how the feet were going to work, so I slapped some feet on so I could kind of get the proportions right on the bottom. You could see at this point I almost was carving it like the knees were sitting up straight, but I decided at the end of the day to have the feet kind of sticking out. Another bonus to doing a stylized carving, my proportions are fairly accurate, but they don't have to be perfect. And as you could see, it was just a process of, this is a subtractive carving, but it's also an additive carving because I'm adding components to it. And I kept the components loose, like I said, so that I could take them off and play around with them before they were finally attached, but just slowly removing that material over the course of a couple months. And if you get frustrated with it, put it aside, come back to it with fresh eyes. Even the next day, you be surprised things that you see with fresh eyes versus tired eyes. And then once I had the arms pretty rough carved, I could finally attach them and then just taper the arms into what was there for the body. This is a really important part because it's going to hide all your seams. So all of my pieces, I kind of carved them as much as I could off the body and then finally glued them on there and then used all of my tools to taper those two joints together so it looked more natural. The body itself is really just kind of like an hourglass shape. That was very easy to do. I just tapered pieces up and off the back, and I was also going to add a tail, so I really smoothed out the back because I knew I wouldn't be able to get tools in there. At this point the arms are left in fists, so I could deal with that later. And there's a lot of stuff that I'll put off on a project if I don't know how I want it to look. So as you're watching this process, the stuff I'm focusing on is the pieces I'm really trying to work out. For the feet, similar process. I just found some raccoon feet. If you're like myself and you can't draw, the nice thing is the internet. You can pretty much find any images you want, print them out, and I got rough outlines for the feet. Once again, you can see the angle grinder is going to remove material the fastest. The angle grinder and the die grinder were kind of a 1-2 punch on this, and then I could come in and fine-tune details. I also have a Dremel, which you'll see later in the video. The reason I'm using the angle grinder and the die grinder is they just are going to work much faster than a Dremel. But if you only have a Dremel, you can carve something like this just out of a Dremel tool. So like I said, this is a Bluetooth speaker, so it's going to be holding the boombox, which will be a Bluetooth speaker, and it was really important that I got perfect right angles on the upper arms, which are going to be the hands. So I used my laser to make those lines, which worked out perfectly, and then I can take an oscillating tool and follow my marks and just notch out a 90-degree angle, and that little bracket is where the boombox speaker is going to sit. This actually worked really well. I have pretty good control with the oscillating tool. I didn't have to sand any of it, and then I could go through and do the hands. You'll see any second this block's going to kind of pop off, and then that is what I'm left with for the arm at this point. You can see the face now is starting to look good, so are the ears, kind of making the form for the mask and forming the nose. Now I knew I wanted the hands to have actual fingers, and I knew at this point, because the plywood's laminated going up versus vertically, that the fingers were going to get extremely fragile. I was able to use a coping saw to cut out the forms around the fingers. I think I broke off one on the other finger, and then I tried my luck with the oscillating tool on the toes, just because there's more material left on the toes at this point. But I knew if I wanted to carve them anymore, I had to reinforce them. So I have this slow set epoxy in the shop. It's not important that it's slow set, it's just what I have. And I kind of got this concept to coat that plywood with it. Epoxy actually sinks into the wood a little bit, and I was kind of hoping it would create an exoskeleton so I could come back and carve the fingers, and that actually worked out really well. So if you have fine details you need to carve, that is an ideal you can use to help reinforce that material when you're carving it. The tail was really simple. It was just multiple blocks of that ply glued together. It's kind of off-center like the Leaning Tower of Pisa, so the tail curves away from the body. It's easiest to make all of these shapes during glue up if you can. And then I basically wanted to keep them like segmented balls. Because I'm not doing any fur, I definitely wanted there to be a visual distinction between the partitions and the tail, because they have varying levels of color in the tail, so it actually kind of looks like one of those stacking toys you use for kids. And then I was working on that as well, and working, kind of jumping back onto the fingers. You could see at this point the epoxy, I really put a lot of trust in it, so I'm using the die grinder to round off those fingers. That inside edge is not going to get touched, that's going to stay the way it is, so that epoxy will always be on that inside edge. And I was able to taper the arm up and carve all of the fingers with various tools without breaking any of them off, which was really nice. So that worked out well with the epoxy. And you can see it's just a process of slowly removing that material and getting the shape. Now the Dremel tool I've been using during this whole process, and like I said, you can do this whole thing with a Dremel. I have a couple different size collets, which if you have that option you can, because then some of these bigger bits, within reason, you don't want to put huge bits in a Dremel, it's not going to have as much power. But I could use different various bits. But the main ones I use are similar to the die grinder. They're just carving burrs. I get all this stuff on Amazon. I don't have, Kutzall is a great brand, and if you have the money, that's what I recommend. If you don't, the bits I'm using are some sort of knockoff Chinese brand company that work pretty well. And I could round off the fingers up top also. And that was kind of what the hands look like. I also got this harebrained idea to put nails on there, which I did a little bit later, because that I was genuinely nervous about breaking off that ply. But you could see how the hands and foot, because I spent all that time doing the carving block, at this point you're starting to see really cool arcs in the wood and really cool patterns forming. I had this nice thing going on in the front where it created this arch, essentially where the belly would be. That was not planned. That was just how the glue up worked. So all of those details were starting to turn out nicely as well. Once I had the tail pretty much carved, I could attach that. So I'm just using a piece of wood in the front. This glue up actually was pretty humorous the way it looked. And the next day, same process. You could see it's almost fully formed off of the body, just so I could carve it in the round without the body getting in the way. And then the next day I could use all of the tools I've been showing you before in order to taper that tail into the back side of the body. So you could see, especially for the arms, the feet, the tail, the ears, it's very much so a rinse and repeat process. I'm just gluing up a somewhat formed or oversized block to the body and then tapering it into what is already there. And then because this is stylized, the forms are very simple. So that was how I did it. I could also use a sanding pad on my orbital sander to sand a lot of the bigger parts, but to sand a lot of the smaller parts I used the sanding disc on my oscillating tool, which worked out really well. Sanding disc on the angle grinder also worked really well, and sanding disc in the Dremel. So if you have one or two tools, you could just buy different bits. Sanding it didn't seem like a lot, but the trade-off of not putting fur in there means you really want all of your curves to be perfect, and I easily spent about 3 or 4 hours one afternoon sanding this whole thing. To put in the nails was actually easier than I thought. Used a really small bit on the Dremel. You could see the before and after. Just formed really simple nails on the feet and the hands just to kind of finish it off. And then if you're used to working with plywood, plywood's going to have a lot of big voids in it. And unfortunately for myself, the 3 spots where I had those were on the face, so I just filled those with some scrap wood before I started painting this. And I haven't fully decided what I want the eyes to look like, but I knew I needed holes for them. So I happen to have some eyes that are usually used for crocheting hanging around the shop, and I just mocked it up with those to start. And then I can mask off where I'm going to be painting everything black. The finish I'm putting on this is a hard wax oil. Hard wax oil is great, but black paint's not going to stick well to the top of it, so I masked off the parts just to kind of be safe with that paint not coming off. On a carving where it's not a surface you're using a lot, it might not have been an issue, but I didn't want to chance it. And then at this point you could see how all the effort that went into making that glue up box starts to pay off because of all the patterns it creates. And once I had 2 coats of Osmo on, I could take all of my blue tape off, and then I'm just going to put some regular old black craft paint where the raccoon is. The black parts were basically the raccoon's distinctive features, so that it's not enough paint to cover all of the hard carving, but just enough to really pinpoint. As soon as you put that black mask on and the striped tail, it reads raccoon. And then the whole reason I made this raccoon was I wanted a funny way to display and use a Bluetooth speaker in the shop. So next week, the final part of the series is going to be showing you how I made a Bluetooth speaker, kind of in the style of an old school boombox.